Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ, and I am so happy to welcome you to today's user share webinar with Rody and Kees. We have two CTPs in the house with us today going to be talking about mastering EUC performance, and I think it is going to be a solid hour of great information. I can't wait to dive into this. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, I've got their Twitter handles for you. If you want to reach out to them on Twitter, there you go. But before we get started and I hand things over to them, I would like to do a couple of housekeeping items here. So first of all, I want to let you know that you are going to receive a link to the recording from today. That email is going to come to you directly from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. You'll have a link to the recording and any other resources that we need to share with you after today's presentation. Also, we'd like to have you submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation. We're going to take those afterwards so that Rody and Kees can get through everything, but do type them in as you have them so you don't forget them. There's a question panel over to the side for you, so type those in anytime. And finally, at the end of the webinar, I'm going to put a link in the chat for you. It's to a short anonymous survey. It's for CUGC use only. And like I said, it's anonymous, it's short, and it's easy to do. Watching all of your questions for us today, because I know you guys are going to have some good ones, is Bart Jacobs. Bart is a CTA, which is a Citrix technology advocate. He is very knowledgeable and ready to dive into this. So Bart, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm looking forward to it. I've seen the presentation deck. It will be a very nice ride, I think. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Bart. All right, so without further ado, I am going to hand things over to the very capable hands of Rody and Kees to get us going. Rody, I'm sending the screen to you right now. There you go.
Thank you. Yep. All right. You should be able to see my screen.
Yep, I see it.
All right, then we're good to go. Kees, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Rody. So before we kick this off, obviously the mandatory introduction of speakers. My name is Kees Baggerman. I'm a technical director for end user computing within Nutanix. I lead a team of highly skilled architects that help us develop collateral. So that's reference architectures, best practice guides, solution notes. With all of that, we're doing a lot of testing. So a lot of the results of that testing you'll see today in this deck. We improve the products with the testing that we do, and the third item that my team does is helping out with either large or complex deals. Rody, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Rody Kossen. I'm a senior consultant at PQR, working mainly in the workspace. So Citrix, but also other vendors. I'm doing a lot of stuff with NVIDIA vGPU. So you will see some GPU today. And I'm doing these researches just based on community effort, mostly in my own time, just because I'm a geek. So that's that. Let's start with the agenda for today. So
yeah, so the
yep.
You want to take this one?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, we will go through the differences between user density and user experience. And we will explain something about how to measure performance via Login VSI and Rex Analytics. And we will share some results from our testing. So what does adding vCPUs to your performance? What's the hardware impact if you change hardware? What's the difference between RDS and VDI? Security patches and their impact, CPU versus GPU. And at the end, we will have some time left for questions and answers.
Yeah, so with the presentations that I like to do, I always define three key takeaways. And while I was chatting with Rody, we looked at this deck, and we kind of collectively looked at it and went like, well, it's interesting to see that if you look at performance, it measures in a couple of ways, and we'll identify a couple of them later on. But in general, if we implement end-user computing environments, it's either fast and good, fast and cheap, or good and cheap. But there's always a trade-off, and hopefully with this presentation, we're able to kind of guide you and help you with overseeing those potential choices that you have to make, and maybe help you implement your environment. So, Rody, I think there's a difference between user density and user experience. Could you help us through what the explain us what the difference is between those two?
Yeah, sure. So if we look at the difference between user density and user experience, it's like the two pictures you see. So the user density is a normal school bus, which is okay. Your user experience is okay, but you have more density. But what most people are asking for is the right picture, so a pimped up bus, and they don't mind how many people there are in the bus. They only mind what the performance of the bus is.
And how it looks and how it feels.
How it looks, how it feels.
Yeah.
So it's more aesthetic than really the density. So they don't mind if they ride 10 liters per 10 gallons per mile or something like that. They want a fast, good-looking bus. But it also depends on who you ask. So is the decision maker like a VP or director of IT, or is it an end user? So there is a real difference between those two.
Absolutely, and you know, in the introduction, we kind of mentioned the testing that we've done, and this kind of next piece is just to go in through the tooling that we've been using. So personally, we've been using, or I've been using Login VSI for most of the testing. And Login VSI simulates realistic workloads, and it predicts the performance impact of updates and upgrades. It might help you find hidden performance problems, and it helps you predict capacity changes. Now, it gives you two, to me, important metrics, and one is VSI base. VSI base is application response times. And in that case, lower is better, right? The faster applications respond, the faster users will get access to their applications and their data. But that is also used to determine a VSI max. So VSI max is basically the number of users a host or a server can handle without going over the threshold of user experience. So for Login VSI, there are two major metrics. One is VSI base, which is application response times, and the other one is VSI max, which is the absolute number of users a node or a server can handle before it kind of
so you can
runs
say
at 100% capacity.
The left one is the school bus in the previous example, and the right one is the pimped school bus.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah.
So looking at architectural perspective, if we look at the environment, Login VSI is very, it's an easy setup. So you have a VSI share, which is nothing more than an SMB share, where you install the log files, the analyzer, the management console, and whatnot. It also has the files that contain the actual testing. You've got launchers that are actually launching these sessions, and that can be either Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, or any other client. It connects to the test platform. It starts the session, Obviously, there's a little bit of Active Directory involved for authentication and authorization. And then you'll see that login VSI is looping through these sessions. It's running these synthetic workloads. And depending on the kind of workload that you have defined, you would see a user typing email, waiting a few seconds, then copy pasting it into Excel and so forth and so forth. So it's a predefined synthetic workload that defines the application performance by open and closed file dialogues, and that records back into the VSI share. And with that, we can determine the actual application responsiveness, and obviously we can measure the threshold. If the application responses will go above a certain threshold, then we determine that the server is full in terms of capacity, and that's our VSI max. Obviously, there's another tool as well. And Rody, you're quite experienced with Rex Analytics. Can you tell us about Rex?
Yeah. So Rex Analytics is a tool created by Benny Tridge, one of our fellow CTPs. And it's a bit like Login VSI, but it's more to visualize the difference in user experience. So you can quickly create different scenarios, create screen recordings of them, and also combine it with measurements, with data, raw data from inside the VM, and visualize it for the end user. And you can test many different scenarios. So like differences in the backbone. Do you want to use Azure or AWS? Different settings like vCPU or the amount of virtual RAM you allocate. But I also use it for comparing different endpoints. So comparing a Raspberry Pi versus a IGEL or a Intel NUC. And it looks like this. So you can define different quadrants where you can add either data or a screen recording. And you can easily compare them. So I can use 4 different videos, or I can compare 2 videos with the data underneath it. So it makes it really easy to see the difference. And I think that's the difference with Login VSI, where you only have graphs, and here you can really see what the difference is. It works quite similar. This looks quite complex. But what you do is you have an endpoint. It can be any device. You connect it to a monitor. But between the connection to the monitor, you place a screen grabber, like an Elgato I use, to record the screen. And you connect the endpoint directly to the remote session via RDP or every remoting protocol you want to test. And with the Rex workloads, you can run different workloads like a video or a Lego Death Star, or you can combine different workloads. Those workloads, they write output to the local machine, like the CPU usage, GPU usage, which you can later on use in the Rex Analyzer. So you combine the video stream with a data set from the VM to create comparisons. So you will see 2 different comparisons here today, later on.
So getting into to our test results, just to give you an understanding of how we define performance, right? Because performance is a pretty wide statement to make, or a little widely used. We defined it as user experience, cost, manageability, security, and support. So we looked at the items in our agenda and defined kind of categories for all of these. So when we look at the first step, it's optimizing your image. And obviously optimizing your image, why should I do that? It's improving user experience. We're reducing the number of components that run in that desktop or run in that server OS VDA. So it is more efficient, it runs smoother, it brings into user experience. You're pimping your car. while you're doing it, you're reducing resource consumption. So CPU, I/O, memory, it's all being lowered because of these optimizations, or that is the end goal. So also, it's also beneficial for if you want to drive that large truck with or large bus with a lot of people on it. So density and user experience both have benefits of when you are optimizing your golden image. One thing that we keep saying is know what you're doing. So having the tools available in the market, and I'll talk about the tools later on, but having the tools is great, but knowing what you're doing is the base foundation of creating your golden image and making sure that you have the additional performance going without breaking applications or breaking application integration with other services. Now, how do you optimize? That's a complete different session. So we just kept it short. Disable services and schedule tasks. Remove OneDrive if you're not using it. Obviously, most of us would be looking at Citrix files anyway. Remove Windows Store apps if you don't need them. Candy Crush, you know, I've yet to come across the valid business justification for Candy Crush. Create a script with your optimizations. There are frameworks out there. BizF is one from a fellow CTP that does all of this for you, and use tools that are available in the market. BP Analyzer, the Citrix Optimizer, the VMware OS optimization Fling, all of them are able to optimize your desktops. Pick one, pick two, doesn't really matter, but make sure that you know what you're doing and use those tools. But also make sure that you script them. And here's the reason why. So we did some testing. We used a vanilla Windows 10 image, only with OneDrive setup removed and Defender disabled, just to make sure that our testing was valid. That was our baseline. That's our 100%. Now we looked at an optimized version of this vanilla image, and we ran log and VSI, and we saw that there was a 48% difference in user density. So just by running these optimizations in the tool, we got 48% higher densities on the same equipment with the same base image, but just optimized. Now, we ran the same test with a newer release of that image or that optimization template. As you probably know, these Windows 10 updates are following up in a rapid pace. So that means that these templates, these update or optimization templates are being updated on a regular basis as well. And this is why we mentioned that we think you need to script them, because if you script them and you have the most optimized or most recent version of your templates, then running log and VSI on a optimized V2 desktop pool or machine catalog, we even saw an increase of another 9%. So 57% additional desktops on that same configuration just by optimizing your image. So for us, optimizing your Windows 10 image is not no longer just a nice to have, it's a must have to kind of have that density and a user experience.
Yep.
I'm talking about user experience. Sorry, Rody, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
So while talking about user experience, we looked at application responsiveness as well. And again, the non-optimized image test run was our baseline. That was our 100%. When we ran it with the V1 optimized image, we saw that applications were responding 5% faster than without the optimizations. So just by doing the optimizations, we saw that we could host more users on that same box, on that same server, but we also saw that applications were suddenly responding faster because they needed, like the desktops or the VMs would need less resources to run unnecessary services. And we ran the same test for the optimized V2, and we saw a 9% faster application access and application responsiveness. So overall, having these updates into these optimizations in your image actually brings better density and better user experience measured with log and VSI. So looking at the why, pros are better user experience, higher density. Cons, you need to retest your optimizations because they might impact your applications. From a user experience, we're all good. Cost perspective, good, because we're achieving higher density. Manageability, we need to put in a little bit more work to get our golden image up and running and ready to go. Security and support, you have to know what you're doing in terms of optimization. Sometimes you want to disable certain services that impact either security or support. So again, know what you're doing when you're doing the optimizations of your desktop. Now, interesting enough, we looked at Windows 10 and the updates that we've been getting. So as we all know, Windows 10 has become like a service kind of model where you have to upgrade every so many months, depending on the cycle that you're on. And we've seen this come over and over again. Going from 1709 to 1803 to 1809, et cetera, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is that it might also impact your density. So what we've done, and all the credits to Sven Huisman in my team for doing all this assessing, and Jarian Gibson for doing all of this. We've tested these Windows versions, so 1709, 1803 up to 1909 in October 2018. And this is what we saw. So we saw from 1709 to 1903, we saw a 25% reduction in user density. So that was a big gap, right? We needed 25% more equipment to get to the same densities, moving from 1709 to 1903. I have to say, at the point in time that we tested, 1903 was an insider preview. Now, we ran the same test in December 2019 again, fully updated, similar versions, but with the latest updates. And this is what we saw. So somewhere down the lines, Microsoft probably realized that with all these newer versions that they brought out, they saw a decrease in their densities. And somewhere along the lines, they updated and patched the right things to kind of make that density gap a little bit smaller. So this is what we see today, going from 1709 to 1909 is, and I say just, but it's just 5% versus the 25% that it used to be. So definitely something to keep in mind. If you're moving to a newer Windows 10 version, make sure that you run your updates and that you're fully patched.
Yeah,
now
not
looking
only
at
the security update. That's for sure.
No, exactly. Looking at application responsiveness, we did the same test. Baseline was 1709. We saw it a little bit fluctuating, and this is what we see now. So keep that in mind. If you're migrating to a newer version, it also impacts your density and your user experience from that perspective. So when we kind of sum it up, keeping your Windows update keeps you more secure. You'll be in support and you'll get access to newer features. The cons would be a lower density, which means more hardware, and probably you'd see a lower app responsiveness, which means that your users might complain. So it's something to keep in mind. So from a user experience, it's a little bit red to amber because you'll get lower density and lower responsiveness. Cost is an obvious one. Manageability, because you have to update all these desktops or VMs. And security and support are good because you are in a support cycle and you are fully secured there.
All right. Thanks. So what if you add more vCPUs per desktop? So most of the time I select 2 virtual CPUs for the most workloads. So 2 vCPUs, 60 GB machine is most of the time a golden rule to start with. But what happens if you add more vCPUs in terms of density? Because adding more vCPUs means a much higher oversubscription on your GPU, on your CPU, on the physical CPU. So there's a higher rate between the physical cores and the virtual cores. So the density from, so if we take 2 vCPUs as a baseline, so the 100% baseline, going to 3 vCPUs, you will lose 12% density. It can be that can be a good business case. 12% is not that much. If it improves the user experience big time, then 12% is okay. You would think that if you go from 3 to 4, you will lose again 12%. But in our testing, we only see a drop of 7%. And going further to 5, there's another drop of 4%. But 77% density, yeah, you lose almost a quarter of your users on a system. So it depends on your workload, what's the best solution. But going from 2 to 4 can be a business case. Going further, I don't think so. But what if we look in terms of responsiveness of the apps? So again, the 2 vCPU option is the 100% baseline. You see a slight increase in responsiveness, especially going from 2 to 4. There's an increase of 6%. But there's only 1% difference between 3, 4, and 5. So it's already 5% difference from going to 2 to 3 vCPUs. But what does it really do for the user experience? So we did a test with Rex Analytics on my home lab, which is running on quite a quick CPU, 3.3 gigahertz. So keep that in mind, because that also influences the user experience. So we ran a VM with Windows 10, 1903, fully optimized, with Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops 2003, the latest and greatest, so to say, with 6 GB of memory per VM. And I did a comparison between the 2 and the 4 vCPU. You can see also here my different settings, graphical settings. I hope that the video is okay for you guys. I will also publish it on YouTube. You will receive the link later on. But here on the left side, we have the 2 vCPU, and you can really see that the video is not smooth. And you can also see here on the right that the CPU is 80–90%. But it also depends on which scene the video is in. But with a 4 vCPU, you can clearly see that the user experience is much better. It's smooth. The CPU isn't running at 100%. So if you have another app open, it doesn't influence the user experience of the video. And it's okay, even without a GPU. So using more vCPUs per desktop, the pros: better application responsiveness, so happier users. But the con is that you have lower density and you need more hardware. So better user experience, but yeah, it costs more. But there's no difference in security and support, as we only change the number of vCPU. But it's still a big gap in the user experience. Right.
One of the topics that I on a regular basis touch upon is vulnerability mitigations. We've all been down the Spectrum meltdown foreshadow road. We've seen MDS and how we're mitigating them with BIOS and firmware updates and whatnot. But what is the impact of these security mitigations? So let us look at density first. So our baseline was mitigations applied. That baseline is 100%. But when we disable Spectrum meltdown and L1TF, we gain 40% additional density. Now, I'm in no means propagating that you should disable Spectrum meltdown or L1TF. I'm saying that if you are still in a situation where you have to evaluate enabling this, then this is the gap you need to be aware of. So there is a clear distinction between all mitigations applied and disabling spectrum meltdown L1TF. It is a 40% gap, so it's a pretty steep gap. Now, from a app responsiveness perspective, when we have the mitigations applied, that is 100%. And when we disable spectrum meltdown L1TF, applications just respond a little bit faster, not that much. And that's mainly because we're using, we're not using hyper-threaded cores anymore. So every user gets a full core, which is better for the actual performance. But overall, it's safe to say that all of these mitigations are impacting our density greatly. Now, it's not all bad, right? So just relatively recently, this CVE came out with the cryptographic vulnerability in Windows. We ran a quick test, and what we saw is that by installing the CVE, we actually saw that the user density went up a little bit, just 3%, but it went up. And application responsiveness was going up as well. So security patches are not all that bad, but you just have to kind of find that balance between what your security team wants, between what you think is reasonable, and what the actual performance versus app responsiveness will be. So overall, if we look at these mitigations, the pros are better application responsiveness, or if you disable them. Obviously, better application responsiveness, your users will be happier, you'll get higher density. Now, cons are lower security, and support might be an issue because you might be running in situations that are not supported. And obviously, you need to have a firm chat with your security team. So overall, like what we try to make sure to do is make sure that you test the configuration. Make sure that you know what the impact is of these security measures, and make sure that everybody is aligned with what you're going to do in terms of adding or not adding these mitigations to your setup. And one of my, obviously test those mitigations as well. And this is a topic that comes up in most of my conversations. And I don't know about you, Rody, but this is quite a regular discussion.
Yeah.
Choosing RDSH over VDI or vice versa. And what do we see in density? What do we see in application responsiveness? So what we did is we've tested Windows 10 1909 with patches from December 2019 versus Windows Server 2016 with the same patch level, December 2019. We tested with ZVAD 7.19.12, which was the LTSR available. And what we saw that VDI was our benchmark. So client OS VDAs was the 100%. But with server OS VDAs, we saw 42% higher densities. So that means that a server OS is overall capable of achieving higher densities on the same box than using VDI as a access method. Now, obviously, there is something. This is density. This is great for decision makers and people that have to pay for all of this. What happens for the end user? What is the application responsiveness? Here's what we saw. So for VDI, again, the base mark was, or the baseline was 100%. We actually saw that RDSH or XenApp or server OS VDAs, I don't know how people want to call it, we actually saw that those were applications were responding faster. So it was a 29% delta between VDI and RDSH. So for us, kind of the battle between those two was quite clear that RDSH can still deliver the highest density and the best user experience from those two. Now, obviously, looking at pros and cons between those two, pros for RDSH is better application responsiveness, so happier users, higher density, so happy CFO. Cons might be that for RDSH, you have limited use cases. Maybe you need admin rights, you need user installed apps, so you might have a valid reason to pick VDI versus RDSH. Another one could be support. we still run into applications that are not supporting multi-user operating systems. So you have to go down to a client OS to make sure that your applications are fully supported on your environment. So again, quantification, user experience with RDSH is better. Costs are better because you achieve higher densities. Manageability is similar. Security can be similar. Support might be an issue in terms of application availability and application support from your vendors. Now, Rody, I know that I live in a software world and you love hardware. So could you tell us a little bit about the impact of upgrading your hardware?
Yeah, sure. So we looked at differences between the different Intel CPUs. So first of all, the old Broadwell, the Skylake, and the most recent Cascade Lake. But yeah, it's worth mentioning that it's hard to find the same CPU with exactly the same cores and gigahertz. So we use a 14-core 2.4 gigahertz Broadwell, 16-core 2.1 Skylake, and an 18-core 2.2 gigahertz Cascade Lake. And we looked at the different scenarios in terms of density. So if we take the old Broadwell as a 100%, we see a 70% increase with the latest Cascade Lake series, just by swapping out the CPU. So you can clearly see that the different architecture upgrades Intel did in the different series really impacts the user density in a positive way. So by simply selecting more, also more cores, that's also adding more density, but also the architecture changes in the different CPUs. And if we look at app responsiveness between those different series, we see also an increase, but not that high as the density. But you can get a 13% increase of app responsiveness by selecting the latest series. So if you are currently looking for new hardware, always select the latest series, even though it means that it costs a few more dollars. Although that also depends on which you select, which I will tell more about further on. But the pros of getting better or newer hardware is better application responsiveness, so happier users, higher density, which means less hardware, so your CFO will also be happy. But the cons are that you need new hardware, which also implies cost. So better user experience, but yeah, more cost. Manageability is better. Security is something you can discuss on because the newer CPUs from Intel have hardware fixes for Spectrum Meltdown, for example. So that's why you also will see the better user experience on these and a better density because they don't rely on software fixes. Support can also be better because it's supported longer. But like I said, selecting a newer CPU doesn't mean that you pay more. So recently Intel launched the Intel Cascade Lake Refresh series thanks to AMD because it gives more bang for the buck. So they see that AMD with their EPYC or Threadrippers or Ryzen CPUs give more bang for the buck. So suddenly Intel lowered the prices. So for example, here, if you look at an Intel Xeon, the CPU that I mainly selected for customers was the 54, sorry, which is an 18-core on 3.1 gigahertz. So it's a really fast CPU with 18 cores. costing around $3,800. And if we now look at the refresh series, we can get a 20 core, so 2 cores more, at the same clock speed, 3.1 gigahertz, for $1,300 less, so just $2,500. That's an insane difference, just because there is now more, how do you say it? So because there's AMD now with better CPUs as well.
There's a competition.
Yeah, there's a competition. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll add is that you need to talk to your preferred server vendor, because not all of the server vendors will support the refresh as of now. So if you're interested, then make sure to talk to your preferred vendor to make sure that they have the R series in terms of Intel CPUs.
Yep. But for people who are looking at a new home lab, the Intel Extreme CPUs also dropped. The prices are also dropped by half. So it can be interesting to select the latest and greatest. So people who know me will know that I like to talk about this topic, GPUs. Kees reminds me quite often that the world is not only GPUs. So thanks for that, Kees. But I really like adding GPUs. So how does it work in a virtualized scenario? So we have a physical server. We add a Tesla GPU, or even now we can add certain Quadro GPUs as well to the server. We install a hypervisor on it. And in the hypervisor, we install a small management pack of NVIDIA and virtualization software for the GPU. And due to that management pack, we can create virtual GPUs, just like you can do with a CPU. You can cut the GPU in different virtual pieces. And it's done based on the amount of GPU memory. So for example, if you have a 16 gigabyte card, and you give a VM 2 gigabytes, you can run 8 VMs on that physical card. You can't oversubscribe the GPU memory, otherwise fun things will happen inside of your VM. And inside of your VM, you would install a NVIDIA graphics card driver, which is almost like a normal NVIDIA driver, but then just qualified for the vGPU. And your apps will just see an NVIDIA graphics card. They also have a Quadro driver for CAD applications, so it's certified for the different CAD applications. And if we look at the marketing slides from the user experience tests that they did, they say that the user experience is fair without a GPU, and with a GPU it's good. It's between good and excellent. But if you ask us, it depends. It depends on your hardware, it depends on your workload, it depends on your situation. So CPU can be somewhere between fair and mildly good. And with a GPU, it's excellent. So again, I want to show you some tests. We performed the same test on the same system as the 2 CPU vCPU versus 4 vCPU, but now we did a comparison between a 2 vCPU machine and a 2 vCPU machine with a graphics card in it. So I used the Tesla T4 in my home lab. We selected the T4 2Q profile. So that's a Quadro profile, but that doesn't really matter for the video performance. And I selected the 2 gigabyte just to have enough video RAM for the test. And we ran a YouTube video from Costa Rica. So currently, this is the only way to see Costa Rica for us. So So we selected 4K to get good details of the beaches and all the different animals. For the graphics policy, I used for actively changing regions because they encode the video part with H.264, which is a video encoder. And we set the quality to high. The output was a 1080p monitor, so we didn't use a 4K monitor, but we used the 4K stream in YouTube just to get better quality. And I hope it's gonna play. Yep, there it is. And I was quite surprised, so to say, that the performance of a CPU-only scenario was quite well. So as you can see, the video is quite smooth. It's decoding a 4K VP9 YouTube stream and re-encoding it in 1080p H.264, or a bit lower because I'm not running full screen. But as you can see, the video is quite smooth. But there is a downside. As you can see here, the red graph is the CPU only scenario. So it's maxed out at 100% CPU. So if you have another app running in the background, there are no CPU cycles left. If we add a GPU, we can get a slight better user experience because the video stream is more smooth. And the CPU is dropped more than half. So it's like 40–50% CPU usage with a GPU added. And also in this scenario, I limited the frames per second to 30 frames because it's a very common setting. But I think if you use a GPU scenario, you can easily get 60 frames per second without increasing the CPU usage that much. But the CPU scenario can't go above the 30 frames per second because it's already maxed out at 30 frames per second. But yeah, as you can see, there's a slight difference in user experience, but in terms of CPU usage, you can see a massive difference.
Rody, it's safe to say that we both were impressed by the quality of Citrix HDX pure on CPU, right? It's like you said, we wouldn't be able to do this a couple of months or maybe a year back. Great job by Citrix engineering to make HDX as good as it is today.
Yeah. But it's also worth mentioning that this is only a test with a video stream. So if you have a 3D application which uses DirectX or OpenGL, it can be a different case because it's harder to run that on a CPU or to virtualize it on a CPU. So it really depends on your use case if you need a GPU. So the pros of adding a GPU is, of course, better application responsiveness, so happier users. You can run more apps like 3D or graphic intensive, higher quality image video streams, especially if you run high resolution monitors like ultra wide or 4K. You really need a GPU to run those video streams on that in good quality. But there are some cons. There is lower density because the density is now not the CPU limit, but just the amount of video RAM you can put in a server. As I mentioned before, you slice the GPU up, so it depends on how many GPUs you can place in one server and which video RAM density or capacity you need in a VM. So you will see up to 64 or 96 VDI users on one server. And there are higher costs as well. So you need to buy a GPU, you need to buy vGPU licenses, but it depends on if you use a RDSH scenario like virtual apps. You need a vApps license, which is not that costly. For VDI, you have the virtual PC for the knowledge workers, and for the CAD, 3D CAD or AutoCAD or applications like that, you need a Quadro license, which is more costly than the other ones. But you can go up to 8K resolutions if you want with that. And there's more to manage. So you have drivers in your hypervisor, in your guest OS. And it's more complex because you also need to look at the Windows 10 version versus the driver versus the VDA versus your hypervisor. So there is more to the mix than just this. And you need a license server. So better user experience, higher cost, lower manageability, no change in security, although you add drivers which can have security implications as well. But yeah, better user experience, definitely. Another thing we looked at is changing or tweaking the display protocol. I recently did a webinar about tweaking display protocols, and this can have a massive impact on user experience as well. But it's really depending on your situation, your apps, your networks. There are many different vendors currently out there. So Citrix with the Atrix protocol, Nutanix has Zyframe. You have PC over IP or VMware Horizon or RDS from Microsoft. And there are many different options as well. So do you want lossless or lossy compression, H.264, H.265? There are so many different settings and things to look at. So this is a topic I think I can go on for hours. And
I'm going to stop you.
Yeah, okay. So let's go to the next slide before I talk over time on this topic. So we compared two different protocols, and not to name them because it's not fair, I think, and it's just an example. But if you tweak your protocol correctly or incorrectly, there's a massive difference in density. So you can imagine on the left side, you have a protocol that's optimized for video streams, and you have video intensive workloads. And the right protocol, the protocol B, is optimized for text. You can see really a difference in density there. So tweaking is always a good option.
Hey, Rody,
Yeah.
in the video, you showed a tool that you were using to kind of show the current settings. That is the RDA, right?
Yeah, RDA
and
analyzer.
it's a tool that it's a tool that can help you define the display protocol and define the settings that are optimized for your end user. So if you haven't looked at it as of now, then have a look at RDA just to help you kind of set the tone, because this tweaking your display protocol might help you in both user experience and user density on your configuration.
Yeah, for sure. So with RDA, you can live switch between the policies, which will save you a lot of time, because otherwise you need to log off, change policies, log on again, see what the change impact is. So with RDA, you can do that live for VMware Blast and Citrix, of course. For RDP, it's unfortunately not live because RDP doesn't support live changing of policies. But it's really useful in these situations to use these tools. But as I said, it really depends. It depends on your workload, on your situation. It also depends on the network conditions. So in the previous session I compared working from home against working from the office with the same settings. And that can be a massive difference in user experience or density. But tweaking can change your cost, can change your user experience pretty heavily. So do it right, and ask if you don't know how to tweak it. So it can be either high user experience, high cost, or the other way around, or somewhere in the middle.
And just to close it off before we open up for questions, again, the three key takeaways, and I hope that we've been able to kind of guide you through all of these: fast, good, and cheap. Big two. It's a tough job, but it's something that we as a community need to find a balance in user density, user experience, making sure that we optimize for both without rising the cost through the roof, but also giving users the performance and the user experience that they need. And with that, let's open up for Q&A. Bart, any questions from the audience?
Yeah, they kept coming in. First one is about AMD. Do you guys have any real-world experience with AMD in terms of performance? They pressure Intel on the price point, but do they do the same on the real-world performance point as well?
Yeah, I can answer that one. As we've been testing with AMD as well, they look very promising. Although in our case, we've been testing single socket systems because of the architecture that they have. They don't have to do context switching. They don't have to traverse across the physical bus. So what you'd see in the login VSI testing, and when available, I can do the same testing with Rody for Rex. But what we saw in login VSI is that the VSI base, the application performance was really good, and density was actually pretty sustainable as well. So I do think that AMD with this new CPU, if they're able to kind of maintain quality of build, which the modular way of their chipset is allowing them to do that. If they can maintain quality in terms of chipset, then I think Intel has a potential competitor on the market.
Okay, and how important is VM vCPU configuration, meaning virtual cores versus virtual sockets? Does that make a difference, or is it just a configuration gimmick?
I'll answer that one as well. So in the testing that we've been doing, and also I can't remember specifically if it was Frank Denneman or Duncan Epping. They tested the socket versus core methodology on vSphere. They didn't see a lot of difference. We did the same testing on Nutanix AHV because it makes sense for us to do that, and we saw a little performance difference. So most of what we see is that the socket core ratio is mainly a licensing thing, and it's a way to kind of be cheaper in certain applications. But from a performance perspective, we're not seeing a lot of differences between those configurations.
I only think you will see differences if you add many cores or many sockets. So if you add more cores, virtual cores, than you have physical cores on one CPU, I think it's better to also add a physical socket. So the hypervisor can split it across two CPUs as well.
Yeah, that basically narrows down to the vCPU physical CPU ratio then.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, is there also a relation between the programs and newer CPUs with instructions? So do old programs benefit from newer CPUs as well, or is it just generally faster?
Let me answer that. I think that even old programs can be heavily improved by selecting a newer CPU, because in general the CPUs can do more cycles or more calculations per cycle. So your application performance will improve. Newer CPUs also have newer instruction sets. So instruction sets are the language or yeah, how do you say it? The instructions that applications can use. Most older applications don't know that without an update. So they only rely on the faster clock cycles or more cycles per clock from the newer CPUs. So yeah, even old applications can benefit heavily from newer CPUs.
Okay, do you have any recommendations on over provisioning of CPUs to the back to the vCPU pCPU ratio? Do you have any real time or real world recommendations?
So for RDHS loads, I tend to keep a one-on-one relationship or 1.5 relationship.
I think there's a Citrix blog post by consulting that says 1 to 2.
Yeah.
But I'm with Rody. I'm typically a little bit more conservative, so I take 1 to 5, 1 to 7
with
for
the issues. Yeah, we've seen with the hyperthreading. That's why I use 1.5 instead of 2. So calculating the hypervised score only for half in performance wise. And for VDI workloads, I would say somewhere between 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. But it depends really on the workload. So do you have a heavy CPU intensive workload? Then it's better to go lower. If you don't have that, then 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 can also be good.
I've seen anything between 1 to 2 to 1 to 14, 1 to 15. It's it really depends on application usage, on how your users are operating the application. So it's kind of hard to give that from my perspective. It's kind of hard to give a definitive answer to that for VDI. For RDSH, it's much more defined, but for VDI, it's a little bit more flux.
Yeah. So it's the same. I think feedback we can give, always test in your own environment. So see if you can get some test hardware where you can run your workloads on, and see what's the best performance for your workload.
Okay, then I think it's time for a final question. Have either of you done any testing with WVD?
Yeah, I did. So what's the question about WVD?
Yeah, what are your experiences in terms of scalability, performance?
Well, it depends more on which sizing of the VM you will do. So WVD in an RDHA scenario uses Windows 10 multi-user, which is more heavy on CPU terms than the server OS, because it has more features and it's more feature comparable with normal Windows 10. But it really depends on the sizing you do in Azure. And the only thing I see in Azure is that the clock speeds are quite low, so expect 2.1 till 2.5 gigahertz, which can impact application performance. So if a application needs a high clock speed CPU because it's single threaded, then there's an issue. But WVD in general is running quite well. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions.
Okay.
Okay. I just have a couple of closing slides for everyone. Let me see if I can get that to show. It looks like it's just showing a white screen. Is that what you see?
Yep.
Oh, go to webinar. Let me try and start it again. Nope. Ah, there we go. I think I see it now. How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much. That was extremely detailed and informative. I think that was awesome. Lots of good discussion going on in the chat I saw. I'll make sure, Rody and Kees, I'll get you all the questions so you can see them, make sure there weren't anything that we missed. If there was, and if you didn't get an answer, I'll definitely hound them to answer those questions, and we'll get you some answers, and we'll post those at mycugc.org. I'll open up a forum thread for that, and I'll include a link to that in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow. I'll also include a link to the YouTube videos so that you can see those if they weren't displaying for you. They looked okay to me, but if they weren't playing for you appropriately, then you'll be able to see those in real time. Before we go, just want to let you know about some upcoming events. Obviously, CUGC local meetings cannot happen in person, but we are having them virtually. So the awesome part of this is if you've always wanted to go to a meeting in Twin Cities, but you live in the Netherlands, you can now do that. So as you see, we have a lot of meetings coming up, and there's more getting scheduled every day. So definitely check our events calendar. You can get all of that at mycugc.org. We also have more webinars coming up. We've got a busy webinar schedule this spring. Tomorrow, our Women in Tech group is having a conversation with a chief diversity officer. They're going to be talking about race and gender diversity in the workplace. And even though we're all working at home, these are still issues, trust me. So that's going to be a great one if you want to tune in for that. Also next week, we'll have Login VSI talking about WVD and insights from them. So, and then we have plenty more coming. So definitely check out our events calendar for upcoming events. And finally, just to remind you to stay up to date with everything that CUGC is doing. We're doing our best to keep lots of content and community going through this time. So follow us on Twitter at myCUGC to get the most up-to-date information about all of these virtual events, and visit us at mycugc.org. If you have a question, come into the forums and ask them, or even answer a question. You may be able to help somebody out. And also you'll be able to find other recordings from other webinars, and we've been having a lot of blog activity, so there's great stuff out there for you guys. All right, and finally, I did put in the chat window for you a link to the survey. I'm not sure if I already mentioned that or not. It's short and anonymous. Love to get your feedback. And with that, I think I can let everyone enjoy the rest of their day. Today is Earth Day, by the way, so enjoy Earth Day in any way that you can. Thank you so much, Rody and Kees. Really appreciate you being on with us today. And thank you, Bart, for keeping an eye on the questions. I know there were a lot of them coming in, so appreciate all of you and all of you being on with us today. All right, I hope everyone has a great day. See you guys at mycugc.org again soon. Bye, everyone.